difficult. So you don't
I
get any
know.
information, it's just nothing. They're invisible.
That's right. Because, when you do see a cover and
Yeah.
it does
Yeah.
impact you, or the
When you
design,
hold them.
I know, and smell them. And it was just, there was no pleasure in
Right.
that.
No pleasure. Right.
And then it was really horrible because it keeps saying you only have 6 hours left, or you only
Oh,
have, so it's like the whole thing is how long is it going to take me until I'm done?
yeah. Which is
It was
so
just,
painful.
it was very painful.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I had this fantasy that they were sending you books.
No.
Oh,
But then they did send us the 20, which was great.
oh good.
But then I thought, would we have read differently?
Right.
You
Right.
know?
I mean, I'm more used to it now, but it just feels very slippery. I mean, it doesn't hold me the way it should. It's
No.
hard.
It's just, what
Oh,
a time. Are
we're
we?
getting notes saying we're live.
We
Are we
are?
live? I don't know.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I hope Lynn's going to introduce us.
We're just girlfriends. That's all we're
We're
doing.
just talking here. Well, I guess. Oh, 2 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, we're seeing chats from people. I'm sure Lynn is going to introduce us at some point.
I so appreciate this, Donna. I mean, this was pure selfish on my part. I thought, oh, Donna, we could see each other. We could talk,
Oh, I'm
And
so honored and touched. Oh,
I
and
miss
there's so
you.
much to talk about. I miss you too.
You
Yeah, the
know?
last time I saw you was at Women and Children's First, I think.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. You know what I was remembering when we were in Boston and we did that amazing panel
That
with
was so
Mark Kurlansky
special.
and Ken Burns? Oh my
I
God.
know. I love that. I
Me
just
too. You were
and forever
amazing.
I'll think about just sitting on the shores of Lake Michigan with you,
Oh, yeah.
in your home ground, and just you. It was the first time I had ever heard the third coast, the middle coast.
Right. I remember that so well. Yeah, I've been so fortunate to spend time with you. I've been reading you for a long, long time. And I'm thinking
And
about that book Red, and when you were writing about democracy 20 years ago. Intense.
it is
Oh, I see a
intense.
note from Lynn. Can we start without Lynn? Yes. Okay.
Okay.
So I guess it's time. It's
So
about to be 7. All right. So welcome everyone out there. I hope you can see and hear both of us. We're so happy to be here for Women and Children First. I'm Donna Seaman. I'm the adult books editor for Booklist, published here in Chicago. And I've been reading Terry Tempest Williams since she started writing, I believe. So it's my great pleasure to be here with Terry Tempest Williams, author of Refuge and Leap. And of course, I didn't write an introduction, so I'm just going to read from your little bio here because I want to name a lot of these beautiful books. The Hour of Land, about national parks, Refuge, an unnatural history of family place, Finding Beauty in a Broken World, and When Women Were Birds, many other works. Terry writes from her home ground, the Red Rock Desert of Utah, and she's an environmentalist and an activist and an artist and a teacher. And I'm so happy to be here with you to speak about your most recent book, Erosion, Essays of Undoing. So, Terry, I think you're going to read first, and then we're going to talk about erosion. I have lots of things to ask you. And I think you're reading a piece that none of us will have seen yet. Is that true?
That's true. And Donna, I just want to say how much I love you and what an advocate and supporter you are of American letters. And, a writer like myself, growing up in Utah, living in Utah, you can't imagine that your words will go out in the world. And you have been so kind to me, and you have given me a voice. And I really tonight just want to honor you and thank you. And I'm one of your biggest fans in terms of Identity Unknown, and you're writing about women and art, and you are one of the most artful women I know. And as I said, when I knew that there was an opportunity to have a virtual tour for EROSION, it was so important for me to be able to come to Women and Children First. And I want to thank Lynn and Sarah for providing a space for us as women. And my dream was to be able to be in conversation with you. So this is very selfish in my beloved bookstore of Women and Children First and my beloved friend. We were just talking, for those of you who have joined us, about our friendship. And one of the things I remember most is sitting with our shoes off on the shores of Lake Michigan and you talking about the Middle Coast and talk about a woman with a deep sense of place. So it's just such a privilege to be here with you tonight, Donna, and thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. You're so generous.
You asked if I would read something, and I feel like we are in this liminal moment. We are in this erosional moment where our undoing is our becoming, that this is a moment of reckoning and awakening. And especially now, I think that we all, 9 months ago, the pandemic was a pause, and now it's a place. And how do we engage with that place? And the election has been part of that, alongside deep grief, not being able to be with our loved ones. Now 250,000 citizens dead. And I am haunted by that. The violence we saw this summer ongoing in the streets, racial injustice, police brutality, and now the continuation of this unraveling of democracy, even when we thought we had a breathing space. I don't mean to suggest that we all share the same politics of everyone who has joined us, but I think what we do acknowledge is that this is an open democracy, and increasingly it feels like aspects are closing, and I think we're all alert to that. So I was invited to write something for a friend of mine, Chloe Aregis, who is the daughter of Homero Aregis and Betty Aregis, and they're dear friends in Mexico. He's a great poet and environmentalist. She is their daughter, wrote the Book of Clouds. She's living in the UK and part of Writers Rebel. And she called the week of the election when we were all in turmoil and said, will you write something for us? And I made a vow, Donna, that during this time I would say yes to everything, that it's a way of being of use. And I think for the first time in my life, I feel like a writer, that my pencil is a shovel, that I see my brothers use, having used their whole life, they show up. And that's what this pandemic feels like to me. And so this was a piece. It's not polished, but it was a gesture. And it's called Wind Applause. It's about 5 minutes. When the news finally came that the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, had won the state of Pennsylvania, putting him over the 270 electoral college votes needed to win the United States presidential election, our household cheered. I ran outside, not to the streets, because where we live, there are none, but because in some irrational state of mind, I wanted to let the Wildlands community know that a breathing space was coming. I wanted to let the red sandstone mesas and cliffs and the western public lands that stretched out before me, sacred lands, that in so many ways define America's natural character, that this was going to be a safer environment now under a Biden-Harris administration. But the minute I opened the door, I was met with wind applause, a howling, a whistling, a singing maelstrom of air moving every grass, every finger of sage, every twisted and gnarled juniper and pinyon pine in a wild, energetic dance. A congress of ravens was in full aerial display, playing with the boisterous currents in dramatic dives, swerves, and quick-moving glides with sharp-edged wing banks to secure their positions as they repeated their avian maneuvers all over again. It was impossible not to read the signs as celebratory. The fall of the Trump regime is good news for our species, for the wild, and for the planet. It marks a return to decency and empathy in the White House, lost in these 4 traumatic years. I'm speaking for myself, and living in Utah, there's no presumption that this is a common train of thought, but I'm speaking for myself. I want to say that this signals a repudiation against racism and closed borders where children were cruelly separated from their parents and put in cages. It means the Muslim ban prohibiting refugees and immigrants wanting to come to the United States will be lifted. It means less corruption and more cooperation within our government. But most importantly, this change of power and governance in America offers a global renewal to climate justice for all. President-elect Joe Biden has already promised to restore America's place on the Paris Accord roster. He's made the commitment with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to lead the country, even among our divided states, forward on renewable sources of energy with no more fracking on public lands. And those of us adjacent to Indian country in southeastern Utah, we are hopeful that the Bears Ears National Monument will be restored. As activists worldwide, we can press harder in our renewed resolve to engage in the ecological and climate crisis together. Creativity is required. Collaboration is required. Leadership within groups like Writers Rebel, the Sunrise Movement, and Extinction Rebellion, and every small NGO in this country are showing us the way, fearlessly, relentlessly, understanding that justice, social justice, racial justice, and biological diversity empower the other. The health of our communities and cities and the health of rural communities is directly tied to the health of our forests, deserts, wetlands, and oceans. The survival of the human species is contingent upon the survival of all species. This is planetary health. We've seen the power of the youth with their cries for climate justice, calling for action, not words. We've seen demonstrations, manifestations in every country around the globe, flowing like water in the streets of our towns and cities, eroding complacency as the world burns. And we've witnessed the rise of the seas, the drowning of islands, the frequency and ferocity of hurricanes, the devastations of floods and fires. We, the people everywhere, must take our concerns and turn them into sacred rage. By that, I mean an energy born out of fire that transcends anger and elicits compassion for the only home we will ever know, Earth. Earth now, not Earth in the future, not Earth as we have seen it in the past as a floating body in space, but Earth as our own bodies on the ground and on the line of every decision we now make. Time is up. Time to get back to the daily work of resistance and insistence that change happens, especially in this pandemic that is no longer a pause, but a place to reflect on how our collective sickness infecting our species is not something outside of us, but inside us. Our healing will be contingent not just upon a vaccine, but a change in consciousness. The health of the earth is the health of each other. Early this morning, Venus was dazzling above Adobe Mesa. In these crepuscular hours, I locate a geologic stillness that mirrors my own momentary peace post-election. Outside, I detect a strange high-pitched sound unfamiliar to me. Coyotes, a mountain lion, or maybe I'm hearing the migratory birds passing through on their way south, singing up the sun in new territory. Their voices are unknown to me. So much unknowing, large and small. I've been seeing ants transporting fallen flowers from the desert willow located just off our front porch patio to who knows where. These wee little beings have been waving petals an inch tall above their heads that register as pink sails above their six-legged bodies. They're sort of like 1 inch long snapdragon blossoms. The wind comes and they fall on the patio, and then I've watched them move. The other day, I decided to follow one. For close to half an hour, I walked behind an ant carrying a petal above its head, clutched in its mandibles, moving across the patio, at a quick pace. It continued down the stone path from our porch, then set across the red sand past our office to where a thriving ant colony emerged from the desert floor like a raised fist. Each time, a breeze would come up, threatening to blow the tiny ant over. 2 other ants would appear to hold the ant steady. Then they would disappear. As the ant continued on its mission, projecting this strange shadow ahead, I could see it was on a perilous path, facing cracks between stones, and a patch of prickly pear cactus was ahead. I thought, this will be it. This will be its demise. But then 3 or 4 ants would miraculously appear and help their colleague carry the flower over the chasm and around the spines. And then once again, they vanished. When the ant I'd been following finally arrived to the ant colony, I watched it climb heroically up the cliff with the magnificent blossom still intact. The ant paused and then laid the flower down at the entrance, where it was instantaneously met with dozens of workers who quickly cut the flower into tiny pieces and one by one carried the pink blossom down into their chambers, where I imagined they were lining a pathway to the queen. We have great work before us, and we too will be met with unexpected allies to help us with the obstacles we face. May the spirit of decency, urgency, and empathy carry us forward. The extinction crisis and climate chaos affecting all species is perilous and unprecedented. But the path to protecting Mother Earth is a beautiful one because it is aligned with love. Wild applause is circulating the planet.
Oh, Terry, that's so beautiful. So incredibly beautiful.
I just think about that little ant, and its allies that would just come in these perilous moments, and then it would just continue on its way. And this is going on all around us in the natural world. We just don't see it or know it. But now we have the time.
Well, that's so many things come to mind. The first is that you always emphasize community. I mean, you understand the value of solitude and observation and silence, but then you bring back what you've observed and experienced and you share it. You share it in your beautiful words, you share it in your activism and your teaching. So here's ants. I mean, that's a species completely based on community. There's no individuality in ants, and they communicate chemically. I mean, they're magical little beings. And really, they own this planet. We don't. There's so many billions of them. But you write a lot about community and also the power of beauty. And what you just read brings those forces together. And you've observed this in human gatherings as well. And you write about that a lot. You're very sensitive to ritual and ceremony, to finding meaning in a world that doesn't always generate it, obviously.
I think growing up in a Mormon community where extended family is the norm. I mean, I knew 5 of my great-grandparents. So wow. Genealogy was a living thing around our Sunday dinner table. And I heard my elders tell stories. And always the point of the story would end up being about community, that we are only as strong as the community that we're a part of. And that's been a point of deep grounding for me. It's also been a point of tension, because in a Mormon community, you're expected to think a certain way and behave according to certain rules. And I have broken set more than I have obeyed. But I still believe in community. And as Donna Haraway talks about, the importance of making kin and staying with the trouble, I think both those ideas are part of community, both human and wild.
You write, it's almost a mantra throughout the book, Erosion. We are eroding and evolving at the same time. Eroding feels painful and feels like a loss, even though it can create beauty as it does in the desert as a sculpting force. Evolving seems to be hopeful. One hopes that you're evolving for the better. I wonder if you could talk about the dynamic between the two that you've witnessed. I mean, this shapes the entire book, erosion and evolving coming together.
You know, I'm so aware of the power of, I'm getting comfortable because you're my friend. I'm so aware of the power of a title, that if you choose to write a book called Erosion, you are going to be asked to erode. I didn't think about that when I was working on the book, but then whether it's the erosion of democracy, whether it's the erosion of land, as you say, that brings us to the essence of the beauty of the American Southwest, whether it's the erosion of losing my job at the University of Utah because of the oil and gas, leases that we purchased as a protest, or whether it is the erosion and the death of my brother by suicide. In each of those instances, I'm also aware of how change does create growth. We evolve. We have to. And I think grief is part of that evolution. I wish it wasn't, but I think it is. I think solitude is part of that erosion and also evolution. I think this pandemic, who knows who we will emerge when this lifts. And it's still going to be a long time, I think. Who are we becoming? And so I think this process of eroding takes us to our essence, like wind, water, and time takes stone to the essence of its forms. I keep thinking of Octavia Butler when in the parable of the sower, Lauren talks about how God is change and change is God. I think that's the same thing. And how do we find the strength to not look away, but to embrace this change, not to push it away?
Very powerful. I find myself thinking a lot during this lockdown where we're so focused on the election and so concerned about the election. I keep hearing that phrase, a more perfect union, that we've never achieved. And it felt like we got farther from that than ever the last 4 years. And there's sections in your book where you talk about what seems almost like a mythological time when Congress passed the Wilderness Act in 1964, when it passed the Endangered Species Act in 1974 or 73. And you write the beauty of the Endangered Species Act, which saved, so many creatures and us in a profound way, is that it was a federal act of empathy. It proceeds from our Declaration of Independence, which was supposed to help us form a more perfect union, and portends, you write, a declaration of interdependence, which is what we're talking about. And, it's the truth, it's the fact about our lives, even as we're sort of forced into strange isolation and unwanted solitude. So I love that declaration of interdependence. That's nature, that's how life works. And it's a viewpoint that I think a lot of Americans resist. We have this sort of do-it-yourself, rugged individual, a lot of people will just come out and say that it's all about me and my success and my needs and my ambition. So, thinking back to your ants and carrying the petals, that they're a large organism made up of many individuals, and so are we. But it's hard for us to accept that, I think.
And I think, as you say, so much of this perfect union was predicated on independence and privilege, and it was largely white privileged men.
Now,
and that is changing. And I think that's part of Trump's appeal, although certainly not all. 74 million people supported his vision. And I find that terrifying. But I also find that that is our challenge, especially in a state like Utah, where you go down into our community an hour south on the edges of Indian country in Blandine, Utah, and on many of the local businesses, you see huge signs that say no masks allowed. Talk about interdependence and empathy. What is that? And, I know I have many friends who are saying we owe them nothing, that they are the oppressors, that they represent racism, that they represent misogyny, that they represent, all of the violence on the border. I don't feel that way because I know these people as my family and I love them. And we break bread together. And after, before Biden had the election had been called on that Saturday, I made a list and I called 6 members of my family and a dear friend in the Bayou, Becky Douay, who's Cajun. I met her during the BP oil spill. I knew they all voted for Trump, my brother among them. The most interesting call was to my uncle, who was a former state senator. And I'll try and make this quick, but it's instructive. I called him. He didn't answer my calls. He called my father and said, "Tell Terry I don't want to talk to her. We have nothing to speak about." And we had talked on his birthday, before. And he said, "Terry, we've never agreed on politics, but I love you." And I called him again. He didn't answer. And then he finally called, and he, as is so typical in our family, he said, "Hi, Terry, it's Rich. I don't want to talk to you." And I just said, "Rich, I just want to know what's the bridge? What's the bridge we can make to each other in this divided states of America?" And he said, "There is no bridge." And he proceeded to say, "Are you going to change your stance on abortion? No. Are you going to change your stance on Black Lives Matter? No. Are you going to change your stance on gun violence? No. Are you going to change your stance on the border and immigration? No. Are you going to change your stance on climate change? No." And he said, "Neither am I. So where does that leave us?" And I said, "You're my uncle. I'm your niece. Where is the bridge?" And he said, "If you're serious," he said, "I have known you since you were born. I saw your relationship to nature as a child. You were always the last one when we would go to California to leave the beach. And I swear, Terry, you were doing some hocus pocus to the ocean." And he said, "And I know your relationship with my mother and birds." He said, I read Erosion and I was not inspired. I was enraged. If you're serious, then depoliticize your language and go back to your roots and write about beauty. And Donna, I started to weep. And I said to Rich, "I will make you a vow that the next book I write will be exactly that." And he said, "And here's what I will do. I will continue talking to you." And I just feel like, that's the bridge we have to make in our own families, in our own communities, in our own neighbor. And if I have enough courage, what I will say to my uncle is, if I take the politics out of my writing, and you, Donna, know as well as I do, that ant story is as political as it can be, then I am going to be able to dare to say to my uncle, "I will take the politics out of my writing if you will stop the killing." Because at 85, he is still killing. Elk, coyotes, fox, etc. So this is what we're facing. And I think this too is part of the story of we are evolving and eroding at once. And I'm saying that in a reverse order because I think that's what it feels like.
Well, that's such a powerful story. And I think about this all the time. I read and read and read. You do too. You were a judge for the National Book Award that was just announced last night. You were steeped in works of great intelligence and responsibility, fidelity to facts, to use a phrase you used in your presentation last night. It's in such contrast to people that are not listening to nature, to people that I fear are being fed on lies and outlandish conspiracy theories, good people misled. And I'm aware that it's a tremendous number of people that don't accept anything I accept and don't want to understand what I understand. And I look at you, one of our finest writers. You write with incredible clarity. I wouldn't even call it political. You're a moral writer, a writer of conscience. And I use the word responsibility again because we're surrounded by and besieged by recklessness, the opposite of responsibility. So the care with which you tell stories, your belief in stories, your understanding of how stories shape culture, but how do you, as you say, where is that bridge? How do we read each other's works? How do we tell each other's stories? It's just really mystifying to me, and this is our national quandary now.
One of the things that moved me so much in working with the tribal elders in Navajo country, in Hopi, in the different pueblos, is how they see the world and their wisdom that they hold. And this is not to romanticize it. This is not to appropriate it, but it really is just being in friendship. And after Donald Trump gutted Bears Ears National Monument by 85% in 2017, I remember going back down to see Jonah Yellowman, who is a spiritual leader among the Bears Ears Tribal Coalition. And I said to him, how are you feeling? What are you hearing from your elders? He's in his late 60s. And he said, Terry, what we are hearing from our elders, from the medicine people and in ceremony, is that we have to go deeper. And I think about that every day. How do we go deeper? How can the next conversation I have with my uncle go to another level? How can the conversation between my brother, who's coming next week, deepen? So that it's not just about our opinions, but our soul.
It's, there's so many beautiful sentences in Erosion where you state things. Uncertainty is the way of the world is a line that you say. And that uncertainty of how we can affect each other, what kind of influence we can have on each other, you almost have to just step aside from that and do what you do what you're driven to do, write what you're driven to write. But you always take things further. There's a great theme of civil disobedience in your essays in Erosion. People taking great risks. You've done it. You've been arrested. You lost your job, which I will never get over being shocked by, for an act, completely legal, daring act in trying to buy land to protect it. Many of us are sort of unable to find that path to civil disobedience that will have any impact beyond, maybe a short span. There's a very powerful interview in the book with Tim D. Christopher, who was an activist who served time in jail and has, started his own sort of group to sort of peaceful attempts to protect the land, to step forward, to protect people. I mean, environmentalism, I think, is growing as the climate situation worsens. The idea of environmental justice is becoming much more, as it should be, inclusive of all species and all people and all places that we live. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the idea of civil disobedience. I mean, Tim's very clear that you have to sacrifice sort of everything to devote yourself to it. And in your conversation with him, you understand that not everyone can or wants to or will. So where does that leave us?
As you know, I've always appreciated the metaphor of mosaic, that each of us holds a piece of this larger mosaic. For some, it's spending 2 years in prison, a federal prison like Tim did, for bidding on oil and gas leases up to $1.8 million as an act of resistance. It's an incredible act of bravery on behalf of the planet. But I also think that there are other acts of resistance and insistence, education, art. I mean, what our frontline healthcare workers are doing, to me, every day they go to work is an act of civil disobedience, against what our government, the peril that people are being placed in. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what is my gift? And what is my role to play in my community? And then respond. And right now, I feel like conversations with people who we disagree with politically is an act of civil agreement. An agreement to be human with each other. I'm hearing some feedback. Are you?
No. Hear
Okay.
me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then I'll just deal with it. So if I'm speaking slowly, that's what's happening.
Thank you. Yeah, I apologize to anyone that's having problems out there. Also, this is a good moment for me to say what Lynn would have said, that I see below me on the way my screen is, it says ask a question. And I think those of you out there can enter questions in that box that I will then read and share with everyone, and Terry will answer. So please, if you can open ask a question, that little button, and type in there. I will check on it in a little while and see if we have questions. I'm just going to brazenly say there's another button I see called Buy the Book, nice turquoise box, and I can't recommend Erosion enough. So please support Women and Children First and support Terry and all her good work and buy the book.
Donna, I've got a question for you while we're waiting. You ask about civil disobedience. What can we do? How do we respond? In your beautiful book, which I love, of Identity Unknown, how did these women artists respond? Do you view some of their work as acts of resistance and insistence with the gifts that were theirs?
Thank you so much, Terry. And I love that you pair resistance and insistence. Just as years ago in a book, you paired radical and patience. Radical patience has been a watch phrase for me for a long time. So yes, the idea of artists resisting and insisting, each of those 7 women artists did insist on being who they are, on making the art they felt driven to make. One that pops to mind is Joan Brown, the California painter, who had early success and then abandoned the style of painting that the galleries really loved because it wasn't expressing her growing spiritual sense and spiritual evolution. And the critics hated her spiritual paintings, and it didn't stop her at all. In fact, she made them enormous, huge, so that there was no missing what she had to say. And the works got stronger and stronger. Louise Nevelson, working in New York City, it was kind of a wild place for her. She had no money, she had space, but not actually a studio. And she would just go out and pick up rejects. Everyone's cast off wooden pieces, trash, really, and make it into art. And sort of an early version of recycling for, a higher cause. So, anyone that pursues their creativity, that expresses themselves in new ways that challenge people, that unnerve people. Lenore Tawney took weaving, a traditional craft, and made it into a fine art, working on an enormous scale no one had ever done before by themselves. So yes, so each of those are ways of resistance and expression. The thing about visual art is it doesn't have to be so precise. I mean, your writing is always so exacting. It's emotionally precise, scientifically accurate, politically informed. It takes a lot of, real courage to use language in that way. You can have a wash of blue, a black box full of smaller black pieces. So there's ambiguity there. There's interpretation. Language takes a different kind of valor, I believe, and we all share language. Our inner selves, I'm a very visual person, but the voice in my head is always a voice, it's words. So the contrast between writing and making visual art is very interesting to me. And I think that you take much tougher, braver, riskier stands in a lot of ways with language, because it's more accessible to everyone. And writers who write as you do, with full responsibility and commitment and integrity, you're really putting it on the line, and we're talking about lines in every way.
You know what I've discovered during the pandemic is that I'm tired of being constrained. And I realize how careful I've been as a writer. You talk about the exactitude or getting it right or revising, and having really good editors that could save me from myself. But during this pandemic, I don't want to be constrained anymore. It just makes me weep. I just want to speak, the language women speak when there's no one there to correct us. And I'm interested in collaborations. I'm not so interested in working alone anymore because we're all alone. And a friend of mine, Fazl Sheikh, who is a photographer, he's an American. He's now living in Switzerland, and he's a fine art photographer. We've been collaborating on work around Bears Ears and with the Native Nations. And we were to go out to Bakersfield to do some work. We couldn't because of the pandemic. And in June, I'll make this fast, he sent me a beautiful book that he had made of 30 photographs in 30 years of his work. I was so moved by them, and I was so unable to access them because these were communities of conflict. They were war zones. They were refugee camps. They are heartbreaking in their beauty and terror. And I put it away. And he also sent a book that was pure landscape. And I wept over those, and I could feel it. It was skin, it was blood, it was bone. And I realized that I could not access my own species. And so I made a commitment that on the next full moon to the next moon, this was in July to August, I would greet each day with one of those images with my grandmother's looking glass. And I would enter that photograph and write him a letter. The letters were unchecked, uncensored. They were like jazz riffs. They were silly. They were politically incorrect, perhaps. They were honest. And then I sent them to him. And it was the gift begets a gift. And then about a month later, he said, "Can we share these?" And I said, "No, absolutely not. It's terrible writing. No, they're personal, they're private. They break every taboo. It's a man of color. It's a white woman. It's, where I could go on about all the trespassing." But then I thought, we're in a pandemic. If we cannot be who we are in our authentic selves, even as we're falling apart, then who are we? And so we've published it ourselves, no editor to speak of, other than a copy editor that, again, saved me with my poor grammar. But this is the kind of the guerrilla publishing that I'm interested in now, Donna, where we just reveal who we are as human beings, with nothing to prove, with no place to hide, except for to expose our humanity.
That's very profound, Terry. I'm afraid I've lost your video, but we can still hear you. I would love to read those letters. I guess I've had sort of the opposite response to the pandemic. I love that you feel that it should be liberating in some way, that now's the time to sort of be more of ourselves. I guess it's fear. I have felt very strained and, sort of, quarantined, not literally quarantined, but like that you can't just go out and do things. I go out and take a walk and I'm a little nervous when I see people. Everything feels very risky. So I love that you have sort of the opposite approach to this. And perhaps it's living in a big city where it's hard to kind of feel like you can just let go in any real way.
And really, Donna, I think that's an important point, because I don't see humans. I mean, really, I see rabbits, I see coyotes, I see ants, I see birds. And so maybe, it is this rural-urban divide also.
That's interesting. One thing I also wanted to talk to you about was in rereading Erosion, where you described so many birds and pronghorns and ants and other creatures. I've never been home so much in my life. I've been saying this to people because it's true. I've always been out most of the time at school or work, running around. And I live in the city, but we have a little yard. And we've had a rabbit it was a little tiny bunny, and it grew into a rabbit over the summer. We had an amazing experience with a couple of rescue birds. We've gotten to know the cardinals and the robins and the sparrows and everyone's dogs in the neighborhood. It's been an incredible immersion in other beings. And I think there's been an awakening for a lot of people, because for many people, the only thing they could really do were take walks.
Yeah.
And to suddenly be immersed in your neighborhoods in a new way, I think it's just been really good for people.
Our national parks have never been more full. Arches National Park is just down the way from us, downriver, and it's full. I mean, Brooke and I went the other day to go for a walk, and it was closed. It was to capacity. Now, what is capacity to Arches National Park? There is huge space, open space. I think it's this spiritual need of people to get out. It's the one place where people feel safe and can social distance or physical distance without having it seem awkward. So I think you're right. I think that we are spending time at home, seeing who we live among, not just our own species, and becoming reacquainted. I mean, I can tell you in my marriage, Brooke and I have been married 45 years. We have spent more time together, which is every minute, in 9 months than we have in 45 years of marriage. We've had to quarter off the house, and our house is small. It's not been easy. But on the other hand, I said, Brooke, I think I'm really becoming dependent on you, which I don't like. And yet, I love that. So it's all these paradoxes that we're living with, wanting to see other people, but then we see them and we think, are we going to hurt one another? Wanting to put our arms around someone, but we can't, and yet we keep in touch. It's such a strange time, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And, I think it really focuses us in a lot of ways. And I had a lot of people tell me they've had trouble reading, trouble concentrating during this time. I find the opposite. And of course, reading's been my refuge my entire life. So I know that's kind of my thing. But I found that I've come to treasure it all the more, that what I can find there, and that I can sit here and surrounded by books and escape my precincts and enter in so many other minds. And that reading is always a communion with another mind. And
It's
we crave that.
And we can travel,
That's always
yeah.
Yes. So it's I think it's I hope this is the evolving. We've witnessed a lot of eroding. I hope this is part of the evolving.
One of the things I think that we aren't talking about, and it really haunts me. And last night I had a haunting, if I could call it that. I went to sleep. I had a cup of tea to just calm before bed. And Brooke was asleep. It was late. And when I went to lay down and close my eyes, all I could see were thousands of faces. Donna, you're a sister and I'm sharing this. It felt like 250,000 spirits screaming. What is happening that we are not in a national communal grief? That we are only hearing about the numbers, but we are not thinking about their spirits, their bodies, that they died alone, if they're lucky, with an empathetic nurse or doctor with them, or with families FaceTiming. I think if we cannot embrace our grief as a nation, as families, as individuals, the grief is going to come out sideways. And I don't think we even know what we're grieving. And I actually, as of Sunday, started a grief journal. And every time I feel a grief about something, I write it down. 250,000, this landmark. Grieving about what Trump is doing, selling oil and gas leases as quickly as he can in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That goes in my grief journal. Grieving that I cannot see my father over Thanksgiving. That is in my grief journal. I think we have to take care of our grief and ask each other these difficult questions. What are you grieving most? How might we grieve together? How might we hold this space, even if it's a lit candle, in silence over the phone on a Monday night at 8:30? I think these kinds of rituals, these kinds of gestures do matter.
I'm so moved by you saying that. I wonder the same thing. I'm like, why are not all flags at half-mast all the time now? Why are we not? You hear stories about people who have died sometimes here and there, but that should be constant. That should be the main, crawl on news. That people should be talking about this. Doctors and nurses are talking about their overload and their fatigue. They're such heroes, and why are we not? Why is that not recognized? All the people that process the election too, counting ballots, sometimes
Absolutely.
at great risk. So while we're worrying about not being able to have holidays together, other people their whole lives are destroyed. So, when do we address this?
And I think the mental health issues, are becoming acute. And having lost a brother to suicide through isolation, I think about that all the time. And how do we reach out? How do we just a simple call? When was the last time we cried? In a way, I think we should have a keening hour. And if we don't, again, I think it will be violent. And I think about Willie Gray Eyes. When I asked him, what do you do with your anger? This was again associated with the loss of Bears Ears, which is their sacred place. He said, Terry, it can no longer be about anger. It has to be about healing. It can no longer be about anger. It has to be about healing. I was really perplexed by that. And I said, Willie, with a name like Tempest, my anger doesn't go easily. And I said, can you explain that? And he talked about how we have to go to the source of our pain. And he said, if you have a splinter in your heel and you don't remove that splinter, the source of your pain, it becomes infected, and it festers until you cannot walk. And I think about that. What is the source of my pain? What is the source of our collective pain at this moment in this country? And how do we embrace that? How do we, again, find the strength to not look away? And how do we do it together? I don't know, but these are the questions that are haunting me at night.
It's all very haunting. You know, the grief journal is a brilliant idea, and I think, you know, maybe encourage everyone to do that. I mean, people here are readers and writers. We have language. Language is accessible to most of us, and readily so.
And you know what's interesting? What I've found is, on one side, you know, I write on this. I found myself just writing on one side and then turning it, writing on one side, and not knowing that I left this whole blank sheet on the other side. And the other day, 2 days ago, in fact, I realized that if on the other side I write what's the counter to that, it's love. And that grief is love. And I think if we realize that, then it gives us the courage to go deeper, as Jonas says, you know, to look at as our healing, just the listing of our grief, and knowing that it is shared. And that a grief shared is a grief endured.
Yes, that sharing is, it's crucial. And there's so many ways we can do that now. I mean, we're so adaptive. Here we are on this platform, this crowdcast. It feels sort of intimate because I can see you. There's people typing in the chat. So it's completely different than being in a room with people. And yet we are together. We've come together. We've taken time out of our lives to listen to each other, to think about a book that means a lot to us, or a book that we hope to read, a writer that, you know, that has been a teacher to us. I think you've been a mentor to many of us who are here with you tonight. You know, these are acts of communication and coming together, and, you know, an insistence, to use your word. We will not be silenced. We will not be alone. We will embrace the technologies that can be tyrannical and can separate us from the world. But now that we have to be separate, it becomes a way to connect, so that, you know, dark side, light side, dark side, light side. We always kind of navigate our way through that. And I think, you know, that's a source of hope too.
I love that idea about a source of hope, that for me, more and more, it's not so much about hope, but where hope dwells. Just as you say, where we locate that. And I've been thinking about hope as a force field, and that we can share, and that we can create. And Donna, I'm wondering, I'm mindful of the time, if I could just, in closing, share they're the last two paragraphs of EROSION.
Oh, that would be perfect. Thank you.
And I want you to know how much I love you and how much I appreciate your reading heart that ripples to all of us. And I think about you in the Mid-Coast on your shores of Lake Michigan that is so wild and beautiful. And I want you to know the peace you provide for me by knowing that you are alive in the world. So thank you for this conversation, and thank you to Women and Children First, and for all of the men and women who have joined us this evening in community. So this is the last page of a new essay that's in the paperback that's called The Resonance of Stone. And it's based on the fact that Castleton Tower, which is a 400-foot monolith just outside our door, geologists have determined that it has a pulse. Castleton Tower has a pulse, as do we. The health of our communities is compromised. Ravens see this change from an aerial point of view, and not all of it is good. Open pits of toxic water, methane flares, chemicals from frack gas seeping into aquifers. We are learning from both science and the depth of indigenous knowledge how to listen, how to respond and respect and behave in the lands we call home. And I should say that what seismologists, geologists have determined is that stone has a pulse. The earth has a pulse. We have a pulse. And that stone has a resonance, whether it's helicopters, whether it's climates, whether it's earthquakes, whether it's even human speech. Stone is not neutral. We need a fuller kind of kinship and rapport beyond our own species. This is possible. Flesh yielding to fur, bodies conforming to rock. The resonance of stone speaks to our resistance. The resonance of stone is the resistance. We are not alone in what we feel. The vibrational power alive within Castleton Tower is also alive in us. It is heard in the wombs of our mothers. Imagine how this magnetic force field of feeling could erode the corrosive power wielded over the earth and galvanize an evolved power in relationship with the earth. Weathering change creates new forms of ascension, not without its difficulties. When so much is collapsing around us, bowing to beauty as old structures fall and new routes are found, is the unexpected gesture of surprise. Boom, red dust popping through an inversion of clouds. We are evolving, we are eroding, we are eroding, we are evolving at once. Castleton Tower has a pulse. The earth has a pulse. We have a pulse. We are alive to a resounding world awakening. I love you, Donna.
I love you, Donna.
And benediction, I love you too. Thank you,
And-
thank you, thank you.
And thank you to Lynn, and thank you to Sarah, and to all the people who joined us. And let's keep a grief journal and see where that takes us. Because it's really the question of where will love take us?
Yes. You've given people a way forward, Terry, as you always do. And I thank you. I wish you well, peace and love and strength. Thank you, everyone out there. We could feel you.
Indeed.
Good
Thank you,
night.
Donna. I hate to leave.
Thank you, Terry. I know, I don't want to leave either. We'll stay in touch.